Donc, bonsoir, messieurs, dames, dans notre venue ce soir de Hotel Delta. As you can see, we're not at the Sheraton. We have so much capacity in the branch that we have even energy to experiment with different formats, like the cocktail that we had in September, and then also even different venues. So when we said commanding views of downtown Ottawa, I'm not sure at this time of the year that's the case, but if we're still here in May, I'm sure that would be more accurate. But you have to sort of experiment to find out how it actually works. So we hope you'll like this evening, where those of you who are staying for dinner, we go into the other room here on the penthouse level. I want to thank Bob Haig, who has put together the panel tonight, which is a huge job, and the panelists who he'll introduce. John Noble, our past president, who will thank the panel and make some summary remarks. Wissam Salih, who is dealing with social media and communications and doing a great job as a volunteer organization. People who really hit the ball in their areas of responsibility are essential to us. And if there's any among you who feel that you want to make that kind of a contribution, let us know, because we're having a new intake to the board, and we're always interested in renewal. I would like to, you could be in touch with me, for example, if you were so inclined. I don't make that decision, but at least you could get your name into the system, so to speak. I want to thank Snooki Lomo and Christina Warren, the two people who were able to employ, and they just do a super job. And it's very important that I thank AV Canada, who are there's our friend, who have followed us from the Sheraton Hotel and who give us a special rate, a good rate, because we are a civil society organization doing good work, and their leadership in Toronto said, hey, we'd like to recognize that and give you a special rate. So thank you to AV Canada, and thank you to the Delta Hotel, who also is giving us a favorable rate because of the great work that we're doing. So merci beaucoup. Et je vous donne Bob Haig.
Thank you, David. This is actually the second event involving Ukraine I've been involved in with the CIC this year. And there's something called, you're perhaps aware of it, called the Foreign Policy Initiative, which has been going on for a number of years. And Jerry Wright, who is here with us tonight, is the co-chair of that. And on March the 19th, we did a seminar at Foreign Affairs with a range of academics from Russia, Britain, and the United States and Canada. And obviously the timing was, I guess, unfortunate in the sense that the events in Ukraine had started to unfold. But the summary of that discussion is on the CIC website, I believe, isn't that right? So you might want to refer to that, because it was a very stimulating one-day discussion on Russia and the Ukraine. I would like you to begin by thinking back, way back to a different, more peaceful time, to February 2014. On February the 7th, the most expensive games in Olympic history were opened by their impresario, Russian President Vladimir Putin. Neither President Obama or Prime Minister Harper attended, but others did, including the UN Secretary General, the King of the Netherlands, the Prime Minister of Italy, and the President of the Ukraine. Prime Minister Harper later said he was delighted at how well Team Canada was doing at Sochi. When President Putin visited Canada House on Valentine's Day, press reports said he was greeted like a rock star, pictured holding a pair of Canadian mittens over his head. At the same time, the seemingly unrelated turmoil in Ukraine continued, where those opposed to President Viktor Yanukovych's occupied Kiev's independence or Maidan Square. The Sochi Olympics ended on February the 23rd, and the next day Ukraine's parliament ousted Yanukovych, who fled to Russia. 5 days later, the West accused Russia of orchestrating a military invasion and occupation of Crimea. On March the 7th, as if nothing had happened, President Putin opened the International Paralympic Games in Sochi. Russia's annexation of Crimea marks the first time since World War II that one European country has seized part of another by force in clear violation of the UN Charter. Since then, NATO has accused Russia of waging a hybrid war in Ukraine. Ukraine now has serious challenges on two fronts, internal and external. Ukraine's internal problems did not begin with the Maidan protests, but from its inception in 1991. Since then, its economy has declined 30%, and the average Ukrainian is 20% poorer. The Economist calls Ukraine one of the world's most corrupt countries, starting with its ill-planned privatization in the 1990s, spawning an oligarchic class that, quote, sucked up most of the country's wealth for itself. Looking at wealth, not income, a Credit Suisse study found Ukraine is the world's most unequal country. Number two, and this is no surprise, is Russia. Sadly, Ukraine's economic situation could get a lot worse due to the present crisis, with a falling currency, higher interest rates, and inflation above 10%. So far, the IMF has given Ukraine only about 1/3 of the funding it promised in April. Ukraine's external challenges. These are perhaps best summed up by President Petro Poroshenko in a November 27th address to the Ukrainian parliament. He said some of his country's main external challenges are a year-old plan for silent liquidation of Ukraine, a continuing military threat from one of the largest countries in the world, the crisis in the global and European security system, and attempts to again resort to the historically bankrupt policy of appeasement. British professor and regional specialist Anatole Livian, writing for the BBC, states the EU might be making the same mistake Russia made in ignoring realities if the EU tries to bring Ukraine into the West without reference to the Ukraine-Russian economic reality. He makes the point that Russia's trade with Ukraine exceeds that with the whole of the EU, and that Russia has been subsidizing the Ukrainian economy for years through low gas prices. While Ukraine exports raw materials and agricultural products to the EU, it exports manufactured goods to Russia, supporting what is left of the Ukrainian heavy industry. Ukrainians are free to work in Russia, and 3 million of them are doing so now. He asks, how can Ukraine restrict its trading relationship with Russia and move towards the West without ruining its economy? There are, however, some positive elements on the horizon, and they perhaps are a bit unexpected. Polling by U.S. agencies, partially funded by Canadian development aid, indicate positive attitudes to democracy in Ukraine, and these have gone from 38% in 2013 to 64% this November. For the first time since 2009, the answer to the question that these agencies pose, these polling agencies, is Ukraine a democracy? Since 2009, the graph has started to increase, although positive responses are still below 50%. And while they are not to be ignored, or while East-West splits are not to be ignored, the polling finds that almost 60% of Ukrainians support an EU economic agreement. So in conclusion, some questions come to mind. Has the West been too tolerant with Ukraine leaders over the past 20 years in not insisting on necessary economic and constitutional changes in return for political and financial support? Some commentators have said the West missed or ignored Russia's signals a conflict was coming. Has openness among NATO members to Ukraine membership contributed to Russia's unease? Something called the Strator Global Intelligence Group, and a number of you will be familiar with that group, says the most plausible outcome is the neutralization of Ukraine and its commitment to remain outside NATO and even the EU. If this is not a solution, how do we avoid a frozen conflict on Ukraine's border? We are fortunate to have a panel tonight which will have an opportunity to address a range of questions on the topic Ukraine and Russia, Putin's dilemma of war and peace. I am pleased to welcome our four panelists from academia, diplomacy, and politics, and in one case, all three. I will introduce each panelist as they speak, starting with Carleton professor Jeff Sahadeo, who is an associate professor at the Institute of European and Russian Studies and the Department of Political Science at Carleton University. He is the author of Russia, Colonial Society in Tashkent, and has published on nationalism, history, and Eurasia in Canadian Slavonic papers, Slavic Review, and Central Asia Survey. He also works as a consultant for the Global Center for Pluralism. He has discussed the Ukrainian crisis on TVO, The Agenda, as well as various programs on CBC and CTV. Jeff, if you'd like to take the microphone.
Thanks, Bob, for organizing this panel, and thank you to the CIC for inviting me, and to all of you for trudging through the snow on our first real winter day for coming. I wanted to take advantage of the fact we have such a distinguished panel and actually do what I was trained to do, which was originally as a historian, step back a little bit to give us a sense of the longer-term trends that have led us to a situation seemingly unthinkable just a year ago, with thousands dead and hundreds of thousands of refugees in the heart of Europe. The past does not foretell the future, nor does it set Ukraine on a single path. But it does help us to understand the position of all sides in the conflict, whether we agree with them or not. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm from outside the region, so I try as much as I can to understand the complexity of the situation. To start, I wanted to make the point that Ukraine, as a modern nation-state, is a legacy of the Soviet Union. Maybe not a Soviet project, but a project sort of developed under the Soviet roof. There we go. In the late 19th century, the lands that we know as Ukraine, at the time when the idea of a Ukrainian nation was developing, it was still restricted to the urban elites. And you can see the area, contemporary Ukraine, split between primarily the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian empires. Important links across these two empires existed, to be sure, and the Ukrainians in Galicia, far western Ukraine today, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire really kept up the nationalist fight for Ukraine among Ukrainian elites during a time of Tsarist Russification in the 1880s and 1890s. Under Lenin and even Stalin, the Soviet Union sought the allegiance of national minorities in the early Soviet period. And what I try to show in this map here, again, you can sort of see some of the changing boundaries of Ukraine. You can see Galicia on your left, I guess, area that became part of Poland eventually after the end of World War I, after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, when the Russians got out of the war. You can see sort of a larger green area that was claimed as a broader Ukrainian state that never came to be. But what we did have was a Soviet project under the title of the so-called Friendship of Peoples that actually advocated territorial status for national minorities. And Ukraine, in the early 1920s, gained its own territory, its own flag, its own national culture, national literature, though again within Soviet bounds. Under Soviet policy, each Union republic was to contain a significant economic base, which is one of the reasons why the eastern area, the Donbass, was located in Ukraine, even though it was an area that was populated largely by people who considered themselves Russians or who at least spoke Russian. Some of them were not that happy to be part of Ukraine, but that was primarily a political decision. It was, under the Soviet period, advantageous to be part of the so-called titular nationality. So if you're in Ukraine, it was better to be, in some ways, a Ukrainian, in terms of advancing up the party and state ladder, although it was always clear that the Soviet Union was a Russian-dominated project. The Russians were officially known as the so-called elder brothers, continued to dominate military, continued to dominate defense. So each side has its own, having a national allegiance to one side or the other, having that nationality in your passport had advantages At the same time, mass education began the process of telling rural farmers in the West, especially some of the poorest areas of Ukraine then, who generally identified with their religion and village, that they were Ukrainian. Dialects were standardized, ideas of nationality implanted. By the 1930s, however, nationality, or rather nationalism, began to escape the Kremlin's control, partly because of very repressive policies, partly because there were alternative channels of Ukrainian nationalism, as we all know, coming from diaspora in the West as well. And we start to devolve into a cycle of repression and uprisings. In the 1930s and 1940s, we have unimaginable violence, from the death of millions of peasants due to state policies, Soviet state policies and famine, the murder of millions of Jews, and extremely violent wars between and among Polish and Ukrainian nationalists, who both claimed similar territories, then a significant anti-Soviet rebellion. So these are the boundaries of the Soviet Union after the Second World War. So you can see it now taking up the areas in the West that used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then of Poland. It took the Soviet Union more than 5 years after the end of the Second World War to gain control of the Western areas and put down a massive rebellion that probably killed more than Vietnam and Korea combined. The most prominent name to emerge from this era was, as many of you know, Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist leader from the 1930s to 1950s, who's been seen alternately as a national hero or as an anti-Semitic terrorist Nazi collaborator. It's not my point here to adjudicate Bandera, but he can be seen, and what I want to do here is to show him as an important symbol in post-war and independent Ukraine. Bandera's portrayal is one example, as it emerged at the time and as it lives in the memory of Ukrainians today, of a move towards a more polarized vision of a state that contained two peoples, each with its own advantages, each with its own grievances. It's through Bandera that the Second World War, a foundational memory for all citizens of Ukraine, regardless of ethnicity, has in a way become relitigated. Did the Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine prevent fascism from taking over the world, or merely exploit the end of Nazi rule to continue the oppression of the Ukrainian nation? It's so difficult to disentangle fact from myth in Bandera's case. The degree of cruelty of his, among other nationalist and pro-Soviet groups in the 1940s and early 50s, when hundreds of thousands were killed. What mattered in the early 2000s, however, was that President Yushchenko's efforts to elevate Bandera as a hero of Ukraine were seen as a deliberate attempt to denigrate the ethnic Russian community, to place them as losers in the Orange Revolution and its aftermath. And then its abrogation, this abrogation of this national hero status by Yanukovych, had the opposite effect, driving citizens of the same country further apart. The Bandera myth, both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, the national hero myth on the other, on the one hand, the myth of a fascist terrorist leader on the other, shows, at least for the eastern parts of Ukraine and for Russia, because this was burrowed into people's memories when they were going to school in the Soviet Union, helps us understand how these terms like fascist and Nazi leanings have such strong resonance in the East, above and beyond the actual rather nationalist groups who have been operating the post-Yanukovych order. Svoboda, for example, has tied itself quite directly to Bandera's memory. Even so, of course, you can point to Putin, many of Putin's entourage, and accuse him and them of equally fascist views, depending on what you define fascism as, sort of an extreme cultural conservatism, often led today by sort of an anti-gay agenda, anti-Semitic agenda. Though the Hitler-Putin analogies that come up here and in Western Ukraine can be quite misleading, and we might have time to talk about that in the discussion. So there's a certain battle of moral supremacy here that's not helpful to reconciliation. I like Timothy Snyder's phrasing of the wolf crying wolf in Kiev and in Moscow. So to end, I'll make this short. I know we have lots of interesting points to come up. I just want to talk about what I've been actually trying to get at in this very short presentation. First, to say that the idea of Ukraine has historically been contested. The Ukrainian state has been multi-ethnic, and in fact, less than a century ago, national identity was unknown to most within its current borders. The situation now has changed. You can see sort of an ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine, which gives us a little bit of a sense. It's not really the best map, but it's not too bad in terms of thinking at least of how people use language and consider themselves ethnically. You can get a sense of some of the multi-ethnic groups that are involved in this mix. And of course, this is post-Holocaust, so we don't have the Jewish population there. Then we get to what's happened today, where you can see a fairly polarized Ukraine. So what I want to say again to conclude is that memory and symbols can be powerful and sometimes dangerous tools. And in this case, both reflect and drive a chasm between East and West. It's shown here and in other political maps as well, between Russians and Ukrainians, who share both a history in this state. We need to understand, if not agree, or even empathize with the sensibilities and vulnerabilities of all the peoples of Ukraine. So as the violence continues, stoked undoubtedly by Mr. Putin's regional ambitions, we have to look at Ukraine as more than just a prize to be won by the West or by Russia, but as a complicated, shared state where, in the end, we have much more to gain from common understandings and shared histories than if it was a theater for historical propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. You don't have to answer right now. I have a memory somewhere where there was a referendum prior to Ukraine being formed, and that all parts of Ukraine supported its creation in 1991, including Crimea, if I'm right. But it shows, again, at the time, I guess, it was something that sort of united East and West, although the support in various parts of the country were different. But you can tell me if I'm right on that or not. It's now my pleasure to introduce Abina Dan, or known to her friends as Abby. She's from Montreal. She graduated from McGill and then an MA from Carleton University and joined the Foreign Service in 1980. She served in Sao Paulo, The Hague, New York, and opened the Canadian Trade Office in Mumbai. And she was also a fellow at Harvard's Weatherall Center for International Affairs. In Ottawa, amongst many of her jobs here, she was the departmental spokesman and press secretary to both the Minister of International Trade and Secretary of State for External Affairs. Was that Joe Clark and John Crosby? Yeah. That must have been interesting. Abby was ambassador to Ukraine from 2005 to 2008, right after the Orange Revolution. And from 2008 to 2012, she served as Canadian Consul General in Sao Paulo, retiring from the department last year. Abby. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I do have a dog in this fight, and it's Ukraine, so I won't make any bones about that. And what I'd like to leave you with tonight is just a feeling of very pragmatic, practical from someone who has been on the ground, who keeps in touch with what's going on, keeps in touch with the community here, and is absolutely devastated to think of what is happening in Ukraine. A number of colleagues have come up and said tonight, that no one could have thought a year ago that such a thing could have happened. And I must say, I'm one of those. I really didn't think it would ever come to this. And it's an extremely serious situation. And it affects us as human beings and citizens. It affects us as citizen democrats. I think this is an important part of our identities as Canadians. And I'd just like to look at a few aspects of what's happening now in terms of certainly the role of diplomacy. I think that we really need to keep this in mind as we see this conflict and hopefully some type of resolution evolve over probably quite a long time, because this is a very serious situation. And I'd like to talk a bit about what can be done about it. What do I really think can be done about it? People often ask a diplomat, like, well, diplomacy has failed, the conflict's not over. But it's a much more complex situation than that. And I'd like to address some of the factors that I think could make a difference, and then say a few things about where Canada and where we as just, again, citizen Democrats might fit into that. I'd also just like to point out that we're looking really at a situation in Ukraine where there's a short game, which is this conflict that's come up over the last 8-9 months, and a much longer game in the whole region, in Europe, frankly, for the world. And I think the short game will be pretty bumpy, and we have to keep our eye on the long game too. So, what's the role of diplomacy in all of this? Well, it's a very important role. For those of you who've been following the file, I think a lot of the more constructive aspects that have come out of the last few months, particularly since June, when a trilateral commission was established to start looking at the problems after the annexation of Crimea, particularly diplomacy through multilateral institutions like the OSCE has been absolutely key. And mirroring that as well, the kind of diplomacy and ability to create types of consensus and discussions behind the scenes and then come forward with a constructive position from within the EU or the Council of Europe, et cetera, has also been very, very important. So the latest is that the OSCE continues. As you know, we had the Minsk Protocol on the 5th of September. It basically was founded on the 15-point peace plan that President Poroshenko had proposed. It hasn't gone as well as we had all hoped. There was an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, on the 19th of September, which elaborated much more clearly on things like how much military mechanisms and personnel would be taken back from the border, et cetera, et cetera. But we're seeing just actually this week, there was to be a meeting Tuesday in Minsk. At least the Ukrainians wanted the meeting on Tuesday. However, Foreign Minister Lavrov is saying maybe Friday. But again, something constructive is happening in that there is now on the ground in eastern Ukraine representatives from both Kiev and from the Joint Command of the Land Forces of Russia, military personnel who are looking at some of the more specific questions about drawing back behind borders, exchange of detained personnel, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a very busy time for diplomacy with regard to this conflict. And, the topic, sort of Putin's war and peace, this is, we hope, going to be Ukraine's peace. It's not all about what Putin wants. In fact, again, I have a dog in the fight, but this is a very serious thing. I would not agree that Ukraine is not a nation or not a people or just a collection, a historical collection of ethnicities. I think that if you look at the Maidan of 2004, which was a Ukrainian Maidan, now you're looking at the Maidan, the Euromaidan, there is something happening in this country that is not just about ethnicity or historical identity. It's very much about a nation trying to come into its own as a democratic nation, but it's much easier said than done. That being said, I have no illusions as to the power of President Putin and his intentions. If he wanted to command his forces to go in and engage in a full military conflict, there's no question who would win that. The question is, I think now he's even beginning to wonder, is it worth it? Because once you allow yourself to go from terms of engagement of the diplomatic world into the terms of engagement of the military world, you really are in a whole different ballgame. And he and we all realize that. So there's a great deal to be lost by letting things go any further. I think also, as we've seen just since really the last 2-3 weeks have appeared to indicate some change in President Putin and his government's attitude. His most recent speech, State of the Union, was apparently greeted with rather polite applause, and he was much less gladiatorial than he was a year ago after the annexation of Crimea. There's tremendous capital flight. The ruble's devaluing. He's giving speeches to his own people now that they better prepare to hunker down because of economic hardship. So he's in, and of course, the price of oil, which we know all about. This may provide us with some sort of an opening along with diplomacy and along with my next point, which will be internal consolidation in Ukraine to get out of this mess, this terrible, tragic mess, with possibly something saved and even something advanced. So basically, I think that diplomacy is very much going to continue to figure into this situation. In fact, it's going to be key as diplomacy was at the time of the fall of the wall, where we were able to avoid major conflicts at a very difficult time in history. We're in a similar period in history, and we don't really quite know what it looks like. The short game wouldn't look so good for Ukraine, is what I'm getting at. But now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the long game. I'm actually not a very good sports buff at all, so I think the expression is the best offense is a good defense, or is it the other way around? Is that it? Other way around. Okay, so the best defense is a good offense. Well, okay, for this particular game, it's the best offense is a good defense. And when I'm saying that, I'm talking about the real need for and the burden of national consolidation within Ukraine. There are a lot of kind of myths that really bother me when I hear people talking about the Ukraine, Russia, and just the whole kind of East-West, confrontation, and it's black and white, and it's this and that. It's just stupid and ridiculous to talk about things like what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe and with the West. It's completely unconstructive to think of it, and it's not only unconstructive, it's not true. It's factually not true. The real solution to Ukraine's nation building will come from Ukraine. It will not come from the West. It will not come from Russia. It has to come from within Ukraine. And the idea we have, too, in the West that somehow when the walls fell in 91, all these democracies rose up and they're there and they're all rosy and we're all together, it's nonsense. What happened was you had a lot of, the political science term would be competitive authoritarian regimes. And what you had was this sort of technical aspect of elections, and sometimes they were even basically free and fair, but they were elections where elites were just trying to see who would get to run the country. It didn't have to do with an overall institutionalization or even an overall attitude of democracy in these countries. And this is why it's so hard for them. It's also why it's very hard for ourselves, who've come from a tradition of parliamentary democracy and historically have that in our DNA. It's so hard for us to really understand what people in these countries have had to go through in terms of trying to democratize. Very much, I think, probably too, from some of our experiences in foreign policy, I'm speaking of the West generally, when we were trying to democratize or assist democratization in Asia and in Latin America, et cetera, we tended very much to emphasize the institutional aspect of democratization. So get political parties in, get NGOs in, get civil society in, get a constitution, get this, get that. And if you get all that stuff, it's going to be okay. And we did the same thing after the walls fell. We thought, okay, get all this stuff just like we have, and democracy will be okay. But what we didn't realize is that democracy is a bit like the World Wide Web. You can have the structure there, but if the content's not good content, It's not good content. And unfortunately, within these societies, there just wasn't the possibility in many of them, and Ukraine was one of them, to get the kind of democratic content to fill up the institutions. And again, I have colleagues here like David Elder, who worked very extensively in Ukraine, trying to build democratic capacity into the institutions and into the social communities of Ukraine. And this is very important work. In this vein, I recommend you this book, and I'm getting no royalties or anything. This book saved my life when I was ambassador to Ukraine. It's called Virtual Politics: Faking Democracy in the Post-Soviet World. I was beside myself when I was there. I had no idea half the time what the hell was going on. People would say one thing and then they were doing the exact opposite, and there I was, with my good Canadian Girl Scout attitude, and it was just terrible. I read this book and it saved my life. And every ambassador I met after that, I said, get this book, every new ambassador. It goes into the fact that really what you had after the wall was a lot of people who'd been part of Komsomol, the communist youth organization. That was your ticket to get into the party, and then you could get some of the benefits of the society. The people who were in that regime, they just put on Armani suits and Gucci shoes and said that they were Democrats. And this here, I don't even mean it as something funny. It's just true. You must get this book. It's, by the way, Cambridge University Press. I think it's 2005. And the thing is that underneath, there was a whole other system that was a system that had been perfected during the period of the Soviet Union. But believe me, this system exists in other parts of the world too. I mean, it's a very good book from a theoretical point of view, where political technology, as it's called, and administrative resources were ways of manipulating the polity and politics underneath all the rhetoric of democracy. And it worked. And this is why we have these sort of very low topsoil of democracy on the top of so many of these societies. This is why we see the problems we're having in Hungary, in Romania, in Bulgaria, because they weren't real democracies. Now, getting back to Ukraine, you could say that the Maidan of 2004 was a genuine revolution of people saying, we want democracy. But there wasn't enough content to put into it, and then there was a great failure, unfortunately, and I know Senator Andrzejczyk, unfortunately, we agree, a great failure of leadership after the Orange Revolution in terms of taking advantage of a very great historical opportunity. Just to answer Bob's question about, say, was the EU and was the West too soft on Ukraine in terms of asking for constitutional and economic change, we were really kicking them all the time behind the doors. But they didn't want often to change, or there was certainly great power battles going on in the society. And as we all know, in the end, Yanukovych and his people won. So I would like to just say that in terms of coming through the long game and creating Ukraine as a real nation state with a viable democracy and a viable economy, they have a lot of work to do, but I'll come back later to how we can lend a hand. The second part of this internal consolidation of the country is related to economic stability and development. Bob's already given you a lot of the stats I was going to give you, but the fact is that Ukraine is a tremendously rich country, sort of like Argentina and Canada were at the turn of the century. It was a tremendously productive country under the Soviet Union, and it's probably working at 35% of its capacity right now. 65% of the arable land isn't being developed. I could just go on and on. So they have so much that they have to do. And again, our role, what we can do is help do business, be supportive with the IMF, be supportive with financing, because if Ukraine in the next, say there's a frozen conflict, if Ukraine in the next 8 to 10 years could get real democratization happening and real economic stability happening, they would stand a chance against the invasion they've had. Okay, I'm just maybe 5 more? Two more. Okay. Okay. So my last really big point, though, I want to make is another thing. It's strategy. The traditional theory, again, about democratizing, et cetera, has been put the institutions and they will come. But there's a very interesting other book I'd like to bring your attention to. That is called Competitive Authoritarianism. For those of you interested, hybrid regimes after the Cold War. This explains also, it explains also very much how you can predict possibly democratization. And what they have found is the model where you have various criteria that are institutional doesn't work as well as their model. And their model is high linkages, which means a state, say Ukraine, which has lots of linkages with the outside, and where do they have their linkages, versus leverage, states from the outside that have influence on them. And then the third variable is organizational power. That's the organizational power, institutional power within the state itself, Ukraine, to mobilize to do things. And it actually, amazingly, does predict quite well which states can successfully democratize based on the level of these variables versus those that can't. So my grand finale is this. We can assist. We can certainly assist through formal diplomacy as Canada and as a member of the OSCE and various other international organizations. But I would also propose to you that we can assist as citizen democrats, as Canadians, for whom this conflict is aberrant, and who care about what happens to Ukraine, because Ukraine matters in so many ways. What is happening now to Ukraine is undermining 70 years of international norm building since the First and Second World Wars, to an extent that we have never seen since then. This is not acceptable. This isn't okay, and this matters to every single one of us as citizen democrats, not only to our governments. So I would really ask that you think of the conflict in Ukraine in that way. And one last little tip, Auntie Abby's tips. A fascinating book that also helped me understand what the Donbass is about, because the Donbass is kind of like the Wild West out in the East, okay? It's not a normal society. I see some people laughing there. They must be from the Donbass. This is a book called Freedom and Terror in the Donbass, a Ukrainian-Russian borderland from the 1870s to the 1990s, and it's by Hiroaki Kuromiya, strange Ukrainian name. Cambridge University Press, 1998. This will really enlighten you as to the current societal and political basis for what's really happening in the Donbass, which again the West characterizes as some sort of normal part of the country that's against another normal part of a country. It ain't so. Read this book. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Abby. Thanks very much. One of the things you mentioned a couple of times was the role of the OSCE, and that organization, which has been around in several different characterizations, the CSE and now the OSCE, it's very much come to the fore, come to its own, I think, during the Ukraine crisis. I'd now like to introduce Paul Robinson, who is the next panelist. He holds an MA in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Toronto and is DPhil from Oxford. Prior to his graduate studies, he served as a regular officer in the British Army Intelligence Corps from 1989 to 1994, and as a reserve officer in the Canadian Forces. I thought you were from Cambridge, so it's also people from Oxford who do intelligence work, I guess. Eh? He also worked. He also worked as a media research executive in Moscow, and he's published 6 books, and he's written widely for the international press on political issues. In recent years, he has worked on Russian history, military history, defense policy, and military ethics, and he is, of course, a professor at the University of Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you. Listening to Ambassador Dan talking about the importance of diplomacy, it did strike me that it would be nice if the Canadian government did any. But that's my political dig for now, and I'll get back to my speech. Good evening. In his annual speech to the Russian parliament last week, Vladimir Putin quoted the Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin. Putin has cited Ilyin many times, and on 22nd of December, in commemoration of the 60th anniversary of his death, members of the Russian Duma, Federation Council, and presidential administration will hold a roundtable discussion of Ilyin's work in Moscow. It would be a bit like the Senate, the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister's office getting round for a seminar on Northrop Frye. Imagine that if the senator can imagine such a thing, I imagine most of the MPs would say, who's Northrop Frye? But anyway, the point is, Ilyin is very much the Kremlin's favorite philosopher. So in light of that, I thought it would be appropriate to start with a few words from Ilyin myself. And these are from a collection of essays published in the early 1950s under the title Our Tasks. And this is what Ilyin had to say. Other peoples don't know us, don't understand us, are afraid of Russia, don't sympathize with it, and are happy to see it weakened. We are alone, misunderstood, and unpopular. These words, written some 70 years ago, aptly describe what many Russians feel about their relationship with the West at present. And what I'd like to do tonight is to try and reduce some of the misunderstandings people have about Russia's role in the current conflict in Ukraine, because I really do think that our media and politicians represent a grossly simplified picture of it. For us, the war in Ukraine is a product of Russian aggression, pure and simple. We envision the Ukrainian people as being united and aspiring to a European future. We have images in our minds of peaceful demonstrators coming together on Maidan Square in Kiev to protest against a corrupt government, and then being mowed down by the gunmen of a pro-Russian president. We see the overthrow of that president as a victory for democracy, and we view the war which followed as being the product of Moscow's efforts to destabilize Ukraine in order to force it back into Russia's orbit. Russians, unsurprisingly, see things very differently. And my job here isn't to say whether they're right or wrong, it's simply to explain it. They see things very differently. They see Ukraine as divided. And they regard the overthrow of the freely elected president Viktor Yanukovych not as a triumph of democracy, but as a violent coup d'etat instigated at the behest of Western powers. Russians have a well-established respect for order. Having seen the consequences of their own revolution, as well as having lived through the financial and social collapse which followed the end of communism, many Russians feel that even bad order is better than no order. They seek stability. Russians see the West as seeking the opposite. Across the globe, Western powers have intervened to overthrow governments they dislike in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and elsewhere. And in their wake, the West has created anarchy, civil war in Iraq and Syria, a failed state in Libya which has spread terrorism and disorder south into countries like Mali, and now civil war in Ukraine. Russians perceive a pattern here, and they suspect that this chaos is not an unfortunate byproduct of our foreign policy mistakes, but is deliberate. And let me quote here Sergei Glaziev, who is economics advisor to Vladimir Putin, and this is what he had to say. And I'm not endorsing it by saying it, please. I'm not a Glaziev fan by any stretch of the imagination, but this is what Glaziev has to say. To eliminate the threats to its hegemony from China and the Asiatic states, the Americans are provoking a war in Europe. The United States want to unleash a chaotic war in Europe, wipe out its debts to Russia and Europe, subjugate their economic space and take control of their resources. It is a strategy of divide and rule, generate conflicts and provoke war. Russia is the latest victim of this policy, and the weapon used against it is Ukraine. So we see Russia as destabilizing Ukraine, but Russians see it the other way around. It is the West which is doing the destabilizing. How else, they say, can one explain the West's support for the overthrow of Ukraine's elected president and its subsequent support for a government which shells its own cities and kills its own citizens by the thousand? Now, personally, I think Glaziev's view of the world is paranoid and wrong, but I think that our view is somewhat wrong too. Putin is a conservative. He values stability. So too, as I said, do Russians, which is why they support Assad in Syria, Sisi in Egypt, and so on. Destabilizing other countries is not the kind of thing they really believe in. So let me quote at length from a recent article in National Interest magazine by an American professor, Nikolai Petro, who recently returned to the US after a year in Ukraine. This is what Petro has to say. I do not believe that Russia's strategy aims at destabilizing Ukraine. It is already coping with 500,000 refugees. More instability will only produce economic collapse, a failed state, and millions of refugees. What Russia wants, I believe, is a stable Ukraine that will be able to repay the $30 billion it currently owes Russia in private, corporate, and government debt. But it disagrees strongly with the West about how stability can be achieved. The West is not in the least bit concerned with cultural differences in Ukraine and how they affect politics. It assumes that if corruption is reduced, the economy will grow and cultural divisions will simply fade away. Russia, on the other hand, sees Ukraine as a culturally fragmented society. Corruption feeds on this fragmentation and leads to political gridlock. Peace and stability, therefore, require the legitimation of these cultural differences. Actually, I think Petro is right. Russia did not object to the overthrow of President Yanukovych because he was pro-Russian. In fact, Putin disliked Yanukovych, and the Russian government did not consider Yanukovych pro-Russian in the slightest. They actually preferred Tymoshenko, the predecessor. They got on quite well with Tymoshenko. They signed deals with her and all sorts of things, and they really didn't like Yanukovych one bit. So the fact that he was overthrown, it wasn't the problem was that he was pro-Russian. Okay? On the contrary. Rather, the objection was that the coup destroyed the delicate balance between eastern and western Ukraine which held the country together. Russia's objective is to restore the balance. To this end, Russia does not seek to annex the eastern region of Ukraine, Donbass, nor does it want Donbass to become an independent country. Donbass is not at all like Crimea. In his recent speech, Putin spoke of Crimea in mystical religious tones as the place when St. Vladimir was converted to Christianity. And then he said rather oddly that Crimea has the same meaning for Russians as the Temple Mount for Jews. Well, I think that's taking it a little bit far. But the point one you could take from this speech is that Crimea is something of an exceptional case in the Russian mind. Psychologically, it's different than Donbass. So Crimea is the sort of foundation of Russian civilization. Donbass is a bunch of coal mines. So one should not suppose that because Russia annexed Crimea, it wants to annex Donbass. Actually, the Russian government prefers that Donbass remain in Ukraine. But at the same time, it believes that the people of Ukraine will only agree to that if Kiev compromises politically to grant them a share in the running of the country and to reassure them that their culture is protected. That means giving the Russian language some official status, as well as granting some measure of regional political autonomy. Russian military support for the rebels is not, therefore, part of some design to restore the Russian Empire. Rather, its purpose has been to force Kiev to the negotiating table, to put it in a position where it has to make concessions. The aim is to bring the war to an end. One can see that this is so by examining what happened when the rebels with Russian support launched an offensive against the Ukrainian army in late August. The offensive smashed the Ukrainian army south of Donetsk. If the aim had been imperial expansion, then the Russian army and the rebels would have kept on advancing once they had the Ukrainians on the run. Instead, as soon as Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said that he was willing to stop fighting, the Russians forced the rebel leaders to sign up to a ceasefire. The rebels didn't want to. This is really very obvious. They were about to attack the port of Mariupol, which would have been a really major prize for them, but Moscow made them stop. Okay? That is because getting Kiev to the negotiating table was the objective, not capturing territory. In fact, Moscow really actually doesn't want the rebels to be too victorious, because if they're too victorious, then they just make themselves completely independent and won't listen to anything Moscow tells them. Russia's aims are therefore much more limited than commonly understood. This can be seen also in the way in which Moscow engineered changes in the leadership of the rebellion in August. Forcing Kiev to negotiate would be useless if the rebel leaders weren't willing to talk back, and the original leaders weren't. This was particularly true of the primary rebel military commander in Donetsk, Igor Strelkov, who pursued a political agenda which was thoroughly at odds with that of the Kremlin, and who complained incessantly about how he was being stabbed in the back and wasn't being helped by Russia. In mid-August, by means unknown, Moscow found a way of getting rid of Strelkov, and since then other commanders have also, as it were, decided to spend more time with their families. The purpose of the changes is to create a more moderate leadership and also to centralize authority. Far from being orchestrated by the Kremlin from the start, the rebellion in Donbass was overwhelmingly local in origin, with the result that a plethora of independent militias were established, each under their own local warlord. Moscow had little or no control over these people. It is now trying to get some control over them and to centralize power in the rebel republics in order to remove the more recalcitrant leaders and to increase its own ability to control those who remain. The aim is to produce a credible leadership which is able to re-establish order in rebel-controlled areas and is also capable of negotiating a deal with Kiev. The problem with this strategy is that the Ukrainian government remains stubbornly unwilling to offer meaningful concessions which could persuade the rebels to reintegrate with Ukraine. Even the defeat suffered by the Ukrainian army in August hasn't changed this. The defeat helped to persuade President Poroshenko that he could no longer achieve a military victory, but it did not persuade him or anybody else in power in Kiev to take any measures which might bring about a political solution to the war. Russia is thus stuck with a situation it never wanted, two semi-independent quasi-states in eastern Ukraine, which Russia will have to support financially if it wishes to prevent an economic and humanitarian catastrophe. Whether it will now change its policy remains to be seen. The clues coming from Moscow are confusing, and there's a lot of Kremlinology going on in the Russian press because of various changes of minor bureaucrats within the administration, and people are speculating what this means. It's believed that Putin's primary advisor on Ukrainian affairs is former Deputy Prime Minister Vladislav Surkov. And as soon as Surkov's name is mentioned, Kremlinologists get very excited and start seeing vicious and strange plans going on. He has quite a strange reputation. Anyway, Surkov is viewed in many circles as the leader of the Doves. Okay. Glaziev is more like the spokesman of the Hawks. And now in November, rumors circulated that Surkov was on the way out, and another official named Boris Rapoport was on the way in when he was taking charge. But, and Rapoport was seen as being far more sympathetic to the idea of recognizing the rebel republics as independent states. But last week, Rapoport resigned. And then you had speculation in the press about, does this mean Surkov is now back? And lots of headlines saying Russian policy changes, and Russia is now accepting that it cannot have an independent Donbass, and it wants an autonomous Donbass within Ukraine. Other people, though, are saying quite the opposite and saying, no, Russia is now accepting that it hasn't really got any choice but to accept an independent Donbass. So, frankly, it's impossible to say who is right. You know, it's this old-fashioned Kremlinology. We're drawing sweeping conclusions from tiny little clues. So I'm not going to make any predictions. What I do think one can say, though, is the situation is far more complex than the Western media makes it out to be. As far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, all we hear is Russian aggression, Russian aggression, Russian aggression. But there is a lot more to it than that. By focusing all our attention on Russia, we have lost sight of the local origins of the war, have failed to recognize the responsibility of those in power in Kiev for what is going on, and so have encouraged the Ukrainian government to follow what has proven to be a disastrous line of policy. Russia's complaints about the West's role in destabilizing Ukraine, while not entirely fair, are also not entirely devoid of truth. I started out with a quote from Ivan Ilyin, so I will round off with one too. The West, Ilyin said, doesn't need the truth about Russia. It needs a convenient untruth. Its press is willing to publish all the latest rubbish about us, as long as it is abusive and defamatory. That's rather paranoid, but it is true that we need to reduce the amount of abusive rhetoric and start thinking about Russia in a much more sophisticated way. And I hope that my words tonight will contribute in some small way to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And as the final panelist tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Senator Renail Andrechuk, who is born in Saskatoon and a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, a great university. Spent 9 years practicing law, and then she was called to the bench. She was also Associate Deputy Minister of Social Sciences and served as the Chancellor of the University of Regina for 6 years. In 1987, she was named High Commissioner to Kenya and in 1990 Ambassador to Portugal before being called to the Senate in 1993. And she presently chairs the Standing Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade. She was also instrumental, and I think this is important, it goes back to her time as Deputy Minister of Social Services in Saskatchewan, in setting up the Standing Committee on Human Rights, which she chaired for 8 years. She has been an active member of the Ukraine-Canadian community and was a member of the chair of the Canadian-Ukraine Legislative Project. Today, she remains Vice Chair of the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group. She had a full committee hearing or meeting this afternoon. She's going back for votes in the Senate this evening, and we're indeed privileged that she's taken the time to speak to us tonight. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. It's a mixed blessing to be the fourth on any panel. It makes my job shorter, but you look across and everyone is saying, when's that dinner going to come? And so I'm going to try and make it. Excuse me, my voice is gone because I've been talking all day, so do bear with me. Water won't help. I'll just keep talking over it and coughing, and I apologize for that. This whole topic is so broad, so deep, that we're just going to scratch the surface of some few comments. I would love to rebut everyone. I would love to get involved in it. Most certainly one comment I will not engage in is Mr. Robinson's opening remarks. What I do want to talk about, and I was asked to talk about, just a few points. One of them is the elections. I was privileged to lead 4 election monitoring missions to Ukraine, and those were after the Orange Revolution. I chose not to go to the Orange Revolution because I could see that it was an internal dynamic, that we were very desperate to get leaders that would take Ukraine seriously and would put it on a road to democracy. Those who started, and I should say there was, as you said, a referendum, and it was very overwhelmingly throughout Ukraine that an independent Ukraine was what the people of Ukraine wanted. It was not an East-West, and there was this hope of democracy. The difficulty was that there was no idea what the word democracy means in real life to every citizen day by day. We may have been part of the problem because we kept saying, your lives are this and this. You don't have freedoms. You don't have anything. But if you have democracy, you will be given a lot of opportunities to exercise your freedoms. They didn't know how to accept them, how to handle them. They didn't have the rule of law. They didn't have institutions. And while there is a nation of Ukraine, it did not function under a structure of an independent Ukraine many times in its history. But when it did rather well. The difficulty was of aggressions from outside that thwarted their capability. So here you have a nation that started in the early 90s. I think they did quite well at the start for something that was so overwhelming. But very quickly, one should look at the situation, and I don't apologize, the oligarchs, the elites. In Ukraine, it became very, very quickly that if you had the money and the resources, you had the capacity to control a party, a faction, and the leaders. And so the blending of money and oligarchs with the political system thwarted any citizen participation. The other is, of course, there was no such thing as a civil society that can underpin democracy. They had the pioneer movement, they had the Komsomol, but that is not the same as a functioning democratic underpinning of the society getting involved. So by the time the elections had gone a number of ways, people's lives weren't getting any better. And what happened in the Orange Revolution is they thought people who said they were going to change it, make it more democratic, give the, all of the jargon was used. People bought into it. I have no idea. I'm not here to analyze Putin's motives. I'm not here to analyze Yanukovych's motives. I'm not here to analyze Tymoshenko or Yushchenko. But what I do know is that the people thought that when the president, Yushchenko, and the prime minister, Tymoshenko, said that they were going to lead on a democratic route, the people thought so. But they went home hoping it would happen. If you understood the old Soviet regime, is you got a leader and you hoped he would do something for you. But you didn't see that you had to exercise your responsibilities to make them accountable, to be part of the process. Those are tools that took a long time for Ukrainians to understand. So I led election missions after the Orange Revolution. People chose Yanukovych, for example. I don't know if they chose Yanukovych for a multitude of reasons, but the one that kept coming up to me is they wanted a change because under the Orange Revolution, their lives didn't improve. And they saw that the rich got richer and these institutions weren't functioning well, and so they wanted a change. Not unlike we often do. If we think that we're not getting what we need from our system, we vote in someone else, and sometimes to the shock of the people who are running, and sometimes to our own shock 2 weeks later as to why we voted the way we did. So I saw a little bit of democracy in action when people were starting to think about maybe we have options. Maybe we have options. And so I think the election process showed me that there was a lot lacking in the rule of law systems and certainly in the election process. The joke was always, you know, that we grew up when it wasn't how you voted, it was who counted. And the votes were always counted by the authorities. And in fact, in one of the elections that I led, that's exactly what happened. Not the past parliamentary election, but the previous one. Where there were difficulties, they weren't at the local level. People wanted to vote, and they wanted their vote to count. They wanted to show that they could handle that. But when the ballots were taken from the local and taken to the district offices, all of a sudden, the results changed. And they said, we're back to where we were before. So those were some of the challenges before. Then came the Maidan, where people started to say, we put you into office, and we're not being heard, we're not being listened to. President Yanukovych at that time was trying to balance the East and the West and the Russians and the Europeans. But there was a willingness to look at an association agreement with Europe. And in fact, he said he would sign it. And people said, or thought that he would do what he said. When he didn't, they took to the streets. And the Maidan was a very, very singular moment where people took control away from oligarchs and from the leaders. Not fully, but to an extent that had not been done in Ukraine. So when they did so, they demanded change. And of course, they weren't going to go away. We know protests in our country. And President Yanukovych, and I won't go into Russians' influence in there because there was some, but the most important thing was that at some point, President Yanukovych wanted it stopped, needed it stopped. But the lever used was excessive, and it led to at least 100 deaths, literally gunned down in the streets. That shook, I think, the international conscience, but the people of Ukraine. And, of course, Yanukovych left. So that led to a negotiation, to a whole rethinking within the political system. I think it was a singular event for the politicians, who I often worked with, parliamentarians. All of a sudden, the people had a say. So when I led the October mission, and I'll deal with that one, because the presidential election was relatively easy. What was difficult was the security issue. Would the election happen? Could it happen? Whose life might be threatened, including election observers? And so we were concerned about security. We were concerned about how much of the country we could cover, but we were not in any way thinking that we would have as much problems in the electoral system. When we went in, we said we're neutral. We're looking at international standards and OSCE standards. And those were our preoccupations, all of the irregularities. By the time the presidential election with Poroshenko came along, it was pretty well known on the street who was going to win. It was pretty well known where the majority of people would put their vote. And the Electoral Commission handled themselves extremely well, extremely professionally. And therefore, I think the election and its process led to a legitimate presidency. Now, getting to the October election of the Parliament, I think this one faced challenges in the East, but they were also conducted under difficult timelines. Both the presidential and that didn't have the time to put all the pieces in place. The illegal annexation of Crimea prevented over 1.5 million Ukrainians from voting for their president. And when I use the word Ukrainians, I mean the citizens of the state of Ukraine. Many were similarly disenfranchised in the parliamentary elections as they had been in the presidential. But our mission found that both elections were conducted in accordance with Ukrainian laws and international standards. And we concluded, as the rest of the international world, a majority of at least, concluded that there was a genuine reflection of the will of the Ukrainian people. Moreover, the election confirmed Ukraine's desire to be a more pluralistic and accountable democracy. They proved that there is much less support for extremism that had been suggested, and much of it in the Russian press. The Right Sector Party, for example, gained only 2.4% of the vote in the parliamentary elections. The Svoboda Nationalist Party won only 6.3% of the vote. By contrast, new pro-Western parties showed strong support. The people of Ukraine and their government are ready for democracy, and the international community, I believe, is ready to support them. Our support is not unconditional. We recognize the need to address problems with corruption, the rule of law, and other institutional weaknesses. The people of Ukraine and their government have recognized a readiness to confront the problems, and I think this is the key. With this election, they are not going home, they told me, which is what they did before. They voted, and then they prayed. They hoped it would be better. This time they are intricately involved, and they are building accountability systems and levers for their voices to be heard. Now, helping Ukraine return to the path of democracy will be an issue of confronting external pressures, and I think we've been talking about some of them. Ironically, as Ukraine is renewing its democracy, the Kremlin is accusing Kiev of being run by Western-backed fascists. This sort of disinformation is part of a unique strategy being pursued by President Putin in Ukraine. NATO has described this strategy as the hybrid warfare. On the battlefield, the use of so-called little green men, unidentified or proxy forces, have allowed the Kremlin to deny Russia's involvement. Meanwhile, in the sphere of global information, the Kremlin has sought to brand itself as a defender of Russian-speaking minorities. In this way, President Putin has continued to drive close to the thresholds of international law without actually crossing them. President Putin has seen similar strategies succeed in the past, most notably in Georgia and Transnistria, and we cannot take Ukraine and the involvement independent of those. With time, he has managed to turn these nearby Russian-speaking territories into de facto Russian republics. Today, he appears determined to extend his buffer zone between Russia and Europe into Crimea. Crimea, to me, is extremely important because Russia certainly has a definition and a history and a myth about Crimea. But if you read all of history, you'll find that Crimea is extremely unique, belonging to many nations, and perhaps more importantly to themselves, but more uniquely the Tatar fact in Crimea. So the international community's dilemma is not one of a dilemma of war or peace. We can never give up on diplomacy, nor can we remove the military option, but we must not allow ourselves to be blindsided. Yet, that is exactly what the unique tactics of hybrid warfare aim to do. Hybrid warfare is designed to obviate international norms we rely upon to diffuse interstate conflict, and in doing so, they threaten to undermine the very architecture of modern global governance. And I think Abby mentioned that it's taken us 7 years to build international structures. This is where I want to focus the hub of my remarks. It has been 70 years where we have tried to build an international system of norms, institutions, and conventions. The purpose of these mechanisms is captured in the opening phrase of the Charter of the United Nations, and I quote, "to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights of nations large and small, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom." President Putin today is calling those values into question. First, he has shown very little regard for treaties and international law. By invading Crimea, he defied the 1975 Helsinki Accords and the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. In Donetsk and Luhansk, he has shown little intention of observing the Minsk Protocol signed in September. Second, President Putin has shown similar disregard for the rights of nations large and small. In Armenia, Abkhazia, Moldova, for example, there have been examples of undermining the sovereign state which they want to produce or pursue. It is not for outsiders to determine whether a part of a country secedes or moves away. It is for the people within according to their laws and international laws. I have no dispute with Crimeans who would wish to separate, but there is a way to do it. I have no wish to say that Donetsk did not have grievances. I agree that Donbass is unusual, a very, very close to my heart part of the world. But that is not today the privilege of an outside state to interfere. And most importantly, what about sovereignty? What about territorial integrity? Concepts that we've built and worked for and cherished. They're our values, they're international values. So if President Putin has difficulties, he has international levers to reach for and work with. But if you don't think those levers are important enough or basic enough, and then you change, what you're really telling me is you don't believe in those standards, you don't believe in those rights, and you don't believe in the conventions that you have signed up for. In short, President Putin claims to be upholding international law, but in fact, he's contradicting the system of values upon which those laws are based. My greatest concern is the disinformation campaign and the Sputnik initiatives that have been started. I believe that Ukraine has much more democracy and they can reach for levers of information. I am very concerned about people in Russia. I think we owe them some responsibility for their rights under international treaties to receive information from many places, to get freedom of information, to have a free press, to have a legitimate opposition. And I could go on because that's where my passion is, that international standards and the Budapest Memorandum should have been upheld. I could quote many, and I could quote NATO leaders, but I just want to quote Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, who issued a statement underscoring the broader implications of Russia's actions. A dangerous precedent is created when the state which guaranteed the safety to Ukraine in reply to the refusal of nuclear weapons barefacedly violated its sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think that's where we as Canadians and we as the international community must understand that we either stand with the international community, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if we wish to continue the world that we believe in, and we use diplomacy to have President Putin rethink his strategy. He could be a powerful force within those standards, and there is room for his opinion within those standards. It is a rough world. You don't always win. But if that is your aim, then perhaps you don't like the convention because they are compromises. And that's what international diplomacy, and that's what I think Canada stands for, and I think many of our European allies are standing for. It is a moment in history testing us, not President Putin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. We have some time for questions, and I would ask you to come to the microphones, ask a question. We don't have a lot of time, so I'd ask that you keep your comments brief and address a panel or address everyone. And the panelists will give you, I think, a fairly quick response. There's been a number of cries for diplomacy tonight. There's been a range of views. I think there's a lot of questions out there, so please go ahead, Paul.
Thank you very much, Robert. My question is for Professor Robinson, and there's been a lot of talk about diplomacy and maybe the failure of diplomacy. What's always struck me is the role of the EU, and particularly Germany. And I was wondering if you had any views about the EU foreign policy and their policy towards the East, going back a number of years, and particularly as it's always seemed to me from a distance as that may have precipitated the crisis. And particularly, I've never understood why Germany, within the councils of the EU and within that diplomatic community, putting aside the North American perspective, but within that community, could not have foreseen what EU foreign policy was going to lead to.
Paul, go ahead. I think everyone has to be succinct because the time is so tight. So.
I've always been in the past quite a fan of the EU, but I think it's vis-a-vis Ukraine, it is messed up on a massive scale. By the problem with the EU is that to join it, you have to accept an awful lot of reforms. You have to do a huge number of things. You have to take the entire package of the acquis communautaire, everything. And you have to do a whole bunch of liberalization reforms politically and economically, which are extremely, extremely costly. And at the end, you sort of get a promise that you'll get to be a member. And in the case of Ukraine, these costs are even higher than they would be for other countries. But the promise at the end of it isn't really there, because I don't think actually the EU is serious about offering membership. So the EU offered a deal which was actually a really bad deal. And Yanukovych really wanted to sign. And he told everybody he was going to sign. And then at the final moment, he looked at the deal and his economist said, you can't sign this, right? It'd be ruinous. And so I think the EU messed up, frankly. And has to take a share of the responsibility for that.
I think Senator Andrzejczyk had something to briefly say.
I don't think that's the reason why President Yanukovych didn't sign. I think he had difficulties. He knew that how intricately he's involved with Russia, and I think the ultimatums were there. I think he tried to the best of his ability to maneuver both, and in the end he chose. And perhaps he should have not chosen at that time. But I think the EU was, in fact, perhaps not providing the kind of support. But I lived in Portugal. It was that debate when they joined the EU. Was there enough money to create the reforms? This is a never-ending problem. Look at the crisis with Greece. So I don't think you can say the EU failed. They may not have done as good a job, but that's a progress. I mean, they start out saying, here's how we will help you, here is the tranche of money we're going to give you, and it's always, a negotiation over and over again for more and more. So I think that if I have a fault on the EU is I don't think they were focused on Ukraine. I think none of us were that focused on Ukraine when you were looking at Syria, and we've come out of Afghanistan, and etc. There were too many issues, and I think they thought they were doing the best, but it was an ongoing negotiation. I was involved with the eastern flank often. You can't just say they didn't give enough and therefore it was a bad deal and Yanukovych went away from it. No, I don't think that was it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I am Canadian with Ukrainian roots. I wish both countries to have independence and a government that serves its own people. I have two questions for Senator. In Sevastopol, when a cannon shoots at noon, refugees from Donetsk fall on the ground. They know what war and suffering is. There is no dilemma for them. And for Putin. Putin is supported because he is pro-peace. Decades ago, Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. Mm-hmm. Today, Mr. Churchill would not be so optimistic because there will be no after in the case of nuclear war. Are you dragging Canada in this direction? Last week at the Ottawa U conference, His Excellency Mr.
Can you please
James
state the
Bissett,
questions? Just we don't have a lot of time. I'm sorry.
He said that it doesn't matter who will take the cabinet, the policy won't change. I believe it now because 2 days after my friend with his wife went to Orleans nomination meeting. Let me finish. To vote for Honorable David Birchie against General Andrew Leslie. Two men, one in police uniform, tried to prevent my friends' voters from getting inside. There is no space left, they said. I will advise you not to go in.
I'm sorry. We don't have, it's already 7:30, so you're just going to have to pose your question to the Senator.
My question is, are we going to have the same anything but democracy election that took place recently in Ukraine?
Thank you.
I'm not sure what your question is because I think there was democracy in Ukraine.
Question.
I think it's a very important
question, especially for
Yes.
Canadians.
Thank you.
All right. I believe that there was a free and a fair election, and I believe that the international standards were adhered to and the democratic will of the people was expressed. They chose their president. I think they did it democratically according to Ukrainian laws and international standards. If that's your question.
These are some tough issues. Is there one more person that would like to pose a question? If not, I'll ask. Please. No, I think, and it's a question, right? Yes. Could you come to the microphone, please? Sorry. Could you come to the microphone and introduce yourself? Thank you. That's right. It's being taped, so it'll come back to haunt you.
Ina. My name is Ina. So in mass media in Russia, for example, you say that Putin is dictator and he is so bad and he aggressive. But if you look at the media, there's all variety of opinions on mass media. And you can see variety of political programs where both sides are presented. There's also not only Russian politicians, but also American journalists and people from NATO. And you can see the debate. But in democratic Ukraine, the only political program is Schuster program, which is you cannot find any.
Sorry, what's your question?
So how would you comment this democracy in Ukraine when you cannot say your opinion if it's different from government opinion?
Thank you.
And in Russia, where you can express your other opinion.
And who would like to respond to that very quickly?
I'm just going to answer the question. In Ukraine, the issue is that the parties owned some of the press, and so everyone seemed to have their own television station. That's one of the things we've commented on. But when you have a multiplicity of parties and they have a multiplicity of stations, that you at least get diversity. What we're saying is we're looking for more independent press in Ukraine. That's been stated, and they're looking for it. And recently there have been new channels that have come, grassroots that. So I think you get many different points of view. It's not perfect, but the difficulty in Russia, first of all, I never said he was a dictator, nor do I believe anyone at the table. I think he was democratically elected, as many of the previous leaders were in Ukraine. His authoritarian tendencies now are thwarting democratic expression of the free will of Russian people. There is a limit to what I can't go in there. I'm banned. I can't get press into there because they can't get in there. So there is a movement towards thwarting different opinions than the government opinion. I think it should be reversed, and I question what the Russian government is doing with Sputnik.
Thank you. I think, to be fair, Paul, did you have any comments on that? Or?
I'm not a media studies expert. I mean, I think that the press in all countries on Ukraine, from what I've watched, it has been pretty shocking. I think the coverage of events in Ukraine on Russian media have been pretty bad and one-sided, and I think the coverage of events in Ukraine in the Western media have also been extremely one-sided and very bad. So I think there's an all-round problem.
Thank you.
If I may, I mean, you know my dog, but I agree. That's where this is just this lack of recognition of the complexity of the situation. And also there's a question, because it's impossible to get out of situations of this complexity and importance in any, in any group of phenomena without looking at levels of analysis and what factors pertain to what type of outcome you're looking for. And I think sometimes it's just like everyone in the media stirs a big pot of soup, and if it tastes good, it's fine, but that doesn't really get us very far ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to bring coherence to the evening, I'm going to ask John Noble to come forward and thank the panelists and also sum up a bit.
Thank you, Bob. David DeMint introduced me under false pretenses. I have no intentions whatsoever of trying to summarize this fascinating discussion. We'd be here for another half an hour at least. But I think it has been fascinating. You've heard different points of view. That's a great Canadian tradition. It's unfortunate that the issue in some parts of the world, it isn't happening. 2 weeks ago in Ottawa, Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden and former Foreign Minister, was here to receive an award, the Diefenbaker Human Rights Award from Minister Baird, and he also chaired the International Commission on Internet Governance. I spent a fascinating 2 hours with him talking about Ukraine. He started off by saying Ukraine is the most mismanaged country in the former Soviet Union. But he said it's the country which Western countries have to give the most assistance to. He also rebutted the claim that you hear from the Russian side about they weren't consulted on what the EU was doing. He pointed out that the EU institutionally has summits with Russia every 6 months, which is twice as many summits as they have with any other country in the world. And that up until less than a year ago, the Russians weren't interested or never mentioned what was going on in Ukraine. That's someone who doesn't have a big dog in it. He's from Sweden. They used to be neutral, right? Okay, so I mean, but it's just interesting. I want to thank you all for what you talked about. You talked about people in Moscow and Kiev crying wolf, crying wolf. I mean, this is one of the problems. I think that's, and you raised the question: is Ukraine a country? At points in your discussion, I think, gee, is he talking about Canada or is he talking about Ukraine? Because I mean, we have linguistic differences and everything else, and perhaps a unified system of government is not, it's not possible. Professor Robinson, you talked about a lot of different things, the illusions or delusions in Western countries of what the Russian position was, etc. It led me to conclude, well, maybe who's deluded? Is it the West? Is it the Russians, or is it the Ukrainians, or is it all three? I don't know. It's an interesting question that there are very different perspectives on this. Very difficult. Abby, you were great. You talked about the role of diplomacy, the roles of various organizations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, European Union, etc., the United Nations. Obviously, those are very important. And the importance of not underdoing, and this is a point Carl Bildt made very strongly too, not underbuilding the rule of law and the norms that have been established in the last 70 years. A fundamental principle is that borders cannot be changed without the agreement of all parties concerned. And that, I think, is it can't be done. It cannot be done. It can't be. We will never be accepted. Senator Anarchuk, I want to thank you very much for coming. You have a very busy day. As Bob Hegg said, you're chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. It's a very rare occasion when this National Capital Branch has someone from the government side speaking to us. We did have an association with one of your former colleagues, Senator Hugh Segal, come. Senator Colin Kenny has come. But I think it's very important. A couple of weeks ago at our conference on Southeast Asia, we had Mr. Baird's parliamentary secretary come and speak to us. I think it's important you take back a message to your caucus that the CIC National Capital Branch is open to members coming and presenting views. This is a nonpartisan group. The CIC is founded on a nonpartisan principle, and I think that's very important. So as we go forward into the discussion, I realize I'm the last speaker between you and your dinner or whatever else you have planned for tonight. I just want to raise one other issue, which is the question of membership in this National Capital Branch. There are membership forms out there. I think you may find that it's a very useful institution. I'm glad to see some younger people here tonight. There are a lot fewer gray-haired people than there used to be in this organization. Not that we don't welcome gray-haired people. I'm that way myself. But we're looking towards the future of this organization, and it's very important that we get as many young people as possible. So I want to ask you, on behalf of all people here, to thank each and every one of the participants tonight. You've made a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure you will have stoked a lot of further debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for coming. Perhaps we should meet again in a year and see where we are with Russia and Ukraine. That might be interesting. Thank you again.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, I very much appreciate